So this is Byung-Chul Han about the, literacy of society. Without the printing press, there would have been no enlightenment, no culture drawing on reason. In a book-based culture, public discourse is logically coherent. In a culture dominated by print, public discourse tends to be characterized by a coherent, orderly arrangement of facts and ideas. That's, of course, debatable. It's probably romanticism. The political discourse of the 19th century, which was a book culture, was far more expansive and complex than that of today. Yeah, he's right. The famous public debates between the Republican Abraham Lincoln and the Democrat Stephen A. Douglas are a striking example. In one debate in 1854, Douglas first spoke for 3 hours. Lincoln was given 3 hours for his reply, after which Douglas spoke for another hour. Both speakers discussed complex political facts and used equally complex formulations. Listen, I think Trump did that as well, by the way, but like much more punchy and fabulized. He's like, she's a nasty woman. I love that, nasty woman. That was amazing. The audience exhibited extraordinary powers of concentration. For the audience, participation in public discourse was a fixed element of social life. You mean to tell me that people don't listen to 3-hour podcasts? They don't listen to my Content Minded for 5 hours every week? 3 hours? I hope you do. I hope you listen to every single second. This will probably be another hour and a half, 2 hours. Electronic mass media destroys the rational discourse created by the book culture, producing a mediocrity. A mediocrity. I love that. Idiocracy. Mediocrity. The reign of the midwits. He's right. He's totally right. I mean, look at it. We live in a midwit-occupied government right now. Midwit-occupied society. Mediocrity. Electronic mass media has a particular architectonic design. Because of its amphitheatric structure, its receipts are correspondent to passivity. Habermas holds the mass media responsible for the decay of the democratic public sphere. Unlike a reading public, a television public is at risk of being disenfranchised. Quote, the programs sent by the new media curtail the reactions of their recipients in a particular way. They draw the eyes and ears of the public under their spell, but at the same time, by taking away its distance, placing it under tutelage, which is to say they deprive it of the opportunity to say something and to disagree. The critical discussion of a reading public tends to give way to exchanges about taste and preferences between consumers. The world fashioned by mass media is a public sphere in appearance only. I would disagree. I would say the internet goes back to that in a way, because it's polyvocal. You can, talk to the e-celeb that you're watching a podcast of. You can comment. You can quote tweet. Whereas boomers grew up in the age of mass media, the real McLuhan age of the television. What did McLuhan call it? Cold media? I forget. That was only one way. And like I say, if you go to that, it was the last season of Oz. And it was not Shibetta. It was, what was his name? He took over from Shibetta. He took over for the Italians. But he also got killed. What's his name? He was the one that was in Scarface. He was the assassin, remember? Antonio Nappa, that was his name, Antonio Nappa. He had this dialogue about television because that was a huge fixture of Oz, was the communal television, the communal, area in Emerald City where everyone watched the television, where they would watch that Sally woman. They would watch news programs that were integral to the show. Let me find it for you, actually. So, for those who don't know, this dialogue was truly brilliant. So, the structure of Oz, especially the later seasons, what would happen was a main character would get clipped, or they, they met a very unfortunate end, and then they would come back in these segments. And usually these dialogues, they were narrated by Augustus Hill, who was the main narrator of Oz throughout the whole season. So throughout, what was it, 5 seasons? Throughout the whole series. And I believe he He was stabbed around season 3 or 4, I forget. But he was the guy in the wheelchair. And he would accompany these previous cast members who, in the time of their death, there's, it's all like this floating miniature cell that's, clear glass, because every cell in in Emerald City, they're all clear. You could see everything. But that was a symbol, though. That was a metaphor for the clarity, the sort of transparency of each of these characters' lives. And so when a character died, he could reflect from a sort of heavenly perspective in the ethereal realm of this, they're going throughout the other places in Emerald City. They're sort of observing from a ghostly perspective the other cast members who are still living. And they can reflect upon their lives with perfect clarity. And some of the dialogue that was written at this time was absolutely incredible. And this segment about communication by Antonio Nappa and by Augustus Hill is just phenomenal. It's some of the best. It's, I would say, on the level of, if not greater than, a lot of Sopranos writing. Because you have to remember, Oz was the first major HBO series in the 90s before The Sopranos. It was the first one. And then, of course, right when The Sopranos took off, then you have, people almost forget about Oz. But a lot of those characters were also in Sopranos. Eddie Falco was a prison guard. That Kyle O'Reilly later went on to a more memorable male role in Special Victims Unit. Lull and Odor, as I like to call it, or, the Mariska Hargitay show. But of course, it just became pure Mariska Hargitay show. I think they brought back Stabler, because Stabler was also in Oz too. He was the gay lover of I forget which character. But then a lot of them went to The Sopranos as well. But anyways, Antonio Nappa, he took over for Sciabetta as the main. He was a capo in the streets of the Italian mafia, but then he took over as the main guy for the Italians, the Italian group in Oz. And then he later got he was sent to an AIDS ward, and anyways. So he has this dialogue on the nature of communication in the current age. And you have to remember, this was around, I want to say, 95, 96, 97, maybe later. This was when the internet was sort of in its nascent stages of popularity among most people. But television, cold media, the McLuhan, boomer age was still in full force. And he talked about print media. But, okay, so it starts off with Augustus Hill talking about the metaphysical implications of communication, which is really fascinating. In the beginning was the word of God, but then he's like, God wanted someone to speak to, and so man came along, and then all of a sudden, it closes out with Augustus Hill in the end, but we'll get to that. So Nappa, he talks about how, the Gutenberg press creates movable type. Well, actually, in China they had movable type, but, in Europe, the Gutenberg galaxy sort of ideal. And he's like, would Gutenberg be, happy with, jugs and in any corner store, would he be happy with, jugs and, Hustler and Soldier of Fortune magazine, And then he talks about how, in terms of satellites in the digital airwaves, or, what's being formulated as digital airwaves, he talks about how, Alexander Graham Bell formulates this concept of communication with wires. And he says, we always talk about being connected to each other, or, picking up the phone or talking. But he's like, we talk about connection, but we're more isolated than ever. And he goes, back in the day, studies show that the more time you spend on the internet, the more isolated you are from the real world and so forth. They even, all this stuff is not new. This stuff is, very old. It's, this is, mid-90s tier analysis. That if only people knew about the technological Hiroshima that was being unleashed in the, the digitality of all of life. And again, this is why I bring up this dialogue, because it's so integral to what Byung-Chul Han is saying in Infocracy. So he's saying that wires and sound waves and bits of information and electricity that span the world. He goes, who would have known that Alexander Graham Bell would have thought that we talk about communication, but really it's more abstract than ever. In other words, he's alluding to the fact that your subjectivity is imploded by communication technologies. Then he's saying, then the Pentagon or the DARPA and the State Department, they invented computational machines and they laid the bedwork in the 70s and 80s for the internet. And he goes, little did they know that they were pouring concrete that would make the global village. Because you have to remember, the mid-90s, this was the Clinton era, the Clinton era, like global village ideal of the end of history. But really, this show predicts that, maybe it's not as what we appear, it's not what we make it out to be. It's something else. Just truly brilliant analysis. So now he's walking and he's seeing, he's sort of ethereally walking throughout all the prisoners. And of course, they don't notice him because he's a ghost. And he's saying how they look at the, television every single day. The television constitutes their lives. And especially in a prison, right? When you have a communal television. He says this line that we say to each other on the phone or even on the internet, let's keep in touch, but there's no touch involved. They're pouring concrete for the global village, the Department of Defense and DARPA. But really, there's no concrete. There's nothing. There's just this ephemera of communication technology, of bits of information. And then he, of course, is lamenting the sort of typical culture industry critiques of, well, you're just watching crap on television. You're not watching anything meaningful. And it's really amazing. It was incredible because he said, what's going to be the future? Is it, and again, typical Wired magazine type of speculation here. Is it going to be chips in the brain, telepathy created through technology, or is it going to be something else? He goes, really, in the other Oz in Australia, they already beat us to it. There's this tribe of Aboriginals where they don't communicate with words. Well, okay, I'm just going to bracket the HBD, discussion. I know what people are thinking. But anyways, it was a brilliant point. It's an absolutely brilliant point. He says that they don't communicate through language. They communicate through gesture and motion and dance and imperceptible movements of the face and of the body and of the hands. And really, he goes, what's going to happen when the mind reaches its limitation of gathering information? What's going to happen when the mind is able to download information instantaneously, but gets so clogged up with the starry-like aether of the post-Gutenberg telepathic information society that we've created, that we just shut everything down. The satellites fall from the sky. We no longer know how to physically talk and communicate with each other. And that information will be lost to the sands of oblivion. And then we'll go right back to the most primitive of primitive tribes. And language will then cease. And language will become something more gestural, more guttural, more primitive, and more sound in a way that doesn't have the sort of logocentrism of the post-Gutenberg galaxy. And then Augustus Hill says, the word suspended over the aether, the word reaches to space, our words reach toward space. It's, in the way, it's mimicking a metaphysics. But in this reality, communication is driven to its end. And he says, now God no longer wants to listen. And that was another brilliant thing about Oz. I said this before, I think I tweeted about it, is that in Oz, you still have the recognition of sort of, Christian society, or rather metaphysics in a way, where God and the afterlife is still a reality on people's minds. But then by the time you transition to The Sopranos, that becomes questioned. And then by the time you get to later, apart from aberrations like Carnival, By the time you get to later HBO series, like that's it. As in terms of a cultural barometer, purely atheistic, just total terminal leftoidism. Like it's incredible. But that part was so brilliant. That was very Chuohanian. That language through telecommunications is driven to its utter ends. And I just thought that was so brilliant. And it really, as a dialogue, it questions, even back then in the late 90s, it questioned what the purpose of the Infocracy really is. And so Oz is truly a masterpiece. It's a forgotten gem because The Sopranos buried it. As much as I love The Sopranos, that Antonio Nappa dialogue and the fact that all of these prisoners were suspended in the purgatorio of reflecting on their own lives and their own foibles and what it really meant. And the fact that it posited that language was driven to an end. I truly feel that it truly is 10 out of 10. It truly is. But anyways, let's move on to Infocracy, because I'm literally not even halfway through the second chapter, where he talks about the communicative society and communicative rationality of Habermas, which I think is bogus, by the way. I think Habermas is an interesting figure. He's an interesting thinker, but his high-minded liberalism just gets in the way of everything. But we'll see. We'll see.